Hi, my name is RuiFu, and my project examines the relationship between race, gender, and the idea of progress in 19th century America. During this period, Americans frequently described their country as a nation built on freedom, equality, democracy, and opportunity. However, these ideals were not experienced equally by everyone. I will analyze three primary sources: the Frederick Douglass 1852 speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, the Sojourner Truth 1851 speech, And I Am a Woman, and the 1848 Declaration of Sentiments from the Seneca Falls Convention. The first two were assigned in this course, while the Declaration of Sentiments is my outside primary source. My main argument is that 19th century American progress was deeply unequal. These sources show how black Americans and women used the nation's own language of freedom and equality to expose the difference between American ideals and American reality. These sources were created during a period of major political and social conflict. American democracy was expanding for many white men, but political rights remained restricted by race and gender. Enslaved African Americans had no legal freedom, and even free black Americans faced discrimination and political exclusion. Women were also largely excluded from formal political life. They could not vote, and married women faced serious restrictions involving property, wages, divorce, education, and employment. In 1848, reformers gathered at Seneca Falls for the first women's rights convention in the United States. In 1851, Sojourner Truth spoke at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention. 1 year later, Frederick Douglass delivered his 4th of July speech while slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act remained part of American law. Therefore, the central historical contradiction was that the United States was becoming more democratic in some ways while continuing to deny freedom and citizenship to large parts of the population. Frederick Douglass delivered this speech on July 5, 1852, at an Independence Day event organized by the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. Douglass had escaped slavery and had become one of the most important black abolitionist writers and speakers in the United States. His immediate audience included people who already opposed slavery. However, he was also addressing the broader American public because the speech was later printed and circulated. His purpose was not simply to describe the suffering caused by slavery. Instead, he wanted to force Americans to confront the contradiction between their national celebrations and the continued existence of human bondage. When Douglas states, "The 4th of July is yours, not mine," he separates himself and enslaved African Americans from the national celebration. The word yours suggests that independence belonged mainly to white Americans. The phrase not mine shows that the promises of the Declaration of Independence had not been extended to enslaved people. This is significant because Douglass does not reject the ideals of liberty and equality. He uses those ideals as evidence against the United States. His argument is that slavery makes the nation unfaithful to its own principles. Sojourner Truth delivered this speech at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron in 1851. Her perspective was different from that of many white women reformers. She had personally experienced slavery, physical labor, racial violence, family separation, and discrimination as a black woman. Her purpose was to challenge narrow ideas about both race and gender. 19th century arguments against women's rights often described the woman as a physically weak, dependent, and in need of male protection. Truth used her own experience of hard labor to expose that racial limits of that stereotype. Black women were expected to perform difficult physical work, but they were still denied the right given to men. The repeated question, and 18, a woman asked the audience to recognize that black women were women too, even though society did not give them the protection or respect associated with white womanhood. This source is especially important to my theme because it shows that race and gender cannot always be analyzed separately. Truth was excluded not only because she was black and not only because she was a woman. Her experience resulted from the combination of both. We should also recognize that the speech was written down by other people and survivors in different versions. This reminds us that historians must consider not only a source speaker but also how the source was recorded and preserved. My outside primary source is the Declaration of Sentiments adopted at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 and written primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Its purpose was to transform complaints about women's treatment into a formal political argument. The document identifies a specific inequality involving voting, lawmaking, marriage, property, wage, employment, education, religion, and public participation. Its most important rhetorical strategy is its imitation of Declaration of Independence. The document changes the famous statement "all men are created equal" into "all men and women are created equal." By borrowing the structure and the language of a national founding document, the authors argued the women's rights were not a special privilege. They were part of the same natural rights that supposedly justified the creation of the United States. The audience included people at the convention, but the document also addressed lawmakers and the wider public. Its formal style gave the women's rights movement a collective political platform. However, its perspective also had limitations. It strongly criticized women's legal inequality, but its language did not fully explain how race and slavery created different experiences among women. Comparing it with Sojourner Truth, therefore, reveals that the category of woman was not experienced in the same way by everyone. When three sources are compared, they share a similar strategy but speak from different positions. Douglas exposes a national contradiction. He asks how Americans can celebrate independence while millions remain enslaved. His speech focuses most directly on slavery, race, and the meaning of national citizenship. Truth challenges exclusion within more than one reform movement. Her personal experiences shows that discussions of women's rights could ignore black women, while discussion of racial oppressions could also overlook gender. The Declaration of Sentiments turns women's inequality into a formal list of political and legal grievances, rather than focusing on one individual's experience. It presents women's rights as a collective movement demanding institutional change. Their audience also influenced their language. Douglas used patriotic language and irony before an Independence Day audience. Truth relied on personal testimony, physical presence, religious references, and rhetorical questions at a convention. The Declaration used the formal structure of the Declaration of Independence to make women's demands appear consistent with American political principles. In all three cases, the authors or speakers did not ask America to abandon its ideals. They demanded that America apply those ideals more consistently. Together, these sources demonstrate both change and continuity across the middle of the 19th century. One important change was that excluded groups were becoming increasingly visible in public political debate. Abolitionists and women's rights activities use public speeches, conventions, newspapers, and declarations to challenge established institutions. They also expanded the meaning of freedom. Freedom was not presented simply as independence from a foreign government. Douglas connected it to equally citizenship. Truth connected it to recognition across both race and gender. The Declaration of Sentiments connected it to voting, property, wages, education, marriage, religion, and participation in public life. At the same time, major inequalities continued. Slavery remained legal in much of the country. Black Americans remained excluded from full citizenship, and women lacked basic political rights. Even reform movements sometimes treated white women's experience as universal. Therefore, progress should not be understood as an automatic process. These sources suggest that American rights expanded because excluded people challenged the meaning of the nation's ideals and demanded that those ideals include them. In conclusion, these resources reveals both the power and the limitation of American ideals. Douglas demonstrates that national freedom was meaningless when it existed beside slavery. Truth shows that ideas about equality and womanhood were shaped by race as well as gender. The Declaration of Sentiments shows how women's personal, legal, and economical inequalities could be transformed into an organized political demand. Together, the sources demonstrate that 19th century progress did not automatically produce freedom for everyone. Instead, progress created conflict over who could define freedom, who counted as a citizen, and whose experiences were included in nations' promises. The broader significance of those sources is that they allow us to understand American democracy not as an completed achievement, but as a contested system that excluded many people and was repeatedly challenged by those it left out. These are three primary sources used in my presentation. Douglas and Truth are cross sources, and the Declaration of Sentiments is my outside of course primary source. Historical background and images were drawn from the Library of Congress and the National Park Services. Thank you.